But what are we learning so far about what's actually happened in Iran?
Well, g'day, Matt. So far, Israeli officials have not commented, but unnamed US sources have said they believe Israel has struck targets in western Iran. It appears Iran has closed down the airspace in that area. So there's a lot we don't know at the moment, but it does appear Israel may have struck back after those Iranian drone and missile attacks of last weekend.
Mick, is there any significance in where Israel has targeted its offensive, or where it appears it's targeted its offensive in response to that drone attack?
Well, there's probably a few things that have contributed to where we think they might have struck. Firstly, the range of Israeli weapon systems and aircraft will be a factor here. But also, the Israelis will want to have struck back without the risk of a significant escalation, even though this is probably likely to escalate the tension between Israel and Iran at the moment. So I think it's the range of weapon systems and how much the Israelis are likely to escalate the situation.
I'm glad you took us to that point, because I think that is what everyone is now fearing, and really has been fearing since what we saw last weekend with those drones and missiles being launched by Iran on Israeli territory. Given what's happened today and the broader, I guess, tension in the area, what does something like this mean for the possibility of a broader regional conflict in the Middle East?
Well, the Iranians in the last 24 hours were clearly expecting something from Israel. Before this raid, just hours beforehand, an Iranian spokesman warned the Israelis that any attack on Iran would be accompanied by a massive Iranian response towards Israel. So the Iranians clearly thought something was coming. They've indicated that they'll retaliate to any Israeli attack. So it appears that we may see further Iranian attacks against Israel.
How much of that is sort of chest beating, and how much of it is an actual threat of full-on conflict?
Well, certainly there's a degree of performance and chest beating to this, but when Iranian officials publicly declare they will respond to an Israeli attack, they're going to have little choice but to respond. Now, whether that is with a direct attack against Israel or its interests in the region or even its embassies around the world, we'll have to wait and see.
Certainly with regards to last weekend's attack, that was a coordinated effort to defend Israel by the Israeli Defence Force, its allies, the UK, the US also involved in that. But since then, there does appear to have been a shift in rhetoric from Israel's allies. They certainly haven't been as strong in backing Israel's discussion about retaliation against Iran, have they?
No, they haven't, particularly the United States. As President Biden said, take the win. I'm not sure I'd describe last weekend as a win, but certainly it was an extraordinary achievement led by Israel, but with contributions from the United States and other countries to essentially shut down a large-scale Iranian attack against Israel. It demonstrated Iran to be rather toothless in its declarations beforehand, and whether this response was actually required has been part of the debate this week.
Given that Israel has its backers in the US, the UK, other countries as well, any sort of conflict, or certainly with that attack last weekend, we saw their support there. If Iran does act here, does it have any countries in the region that it turns to for support in the same way?
Well, it certainly appears to have the support of the Russians, but countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and others who would be deeply uncomfortable with how Iran is acting at the moment will not be coming out and openly supporting Iran. They'll have difficulties also openly supporting Israel, but I don't expect anyone in the region, with the exception of Hezbollah and Hamas, to come out with full-throated demonstrations of support for Iran if they do respond to these attacks.
When we see something like what's happened today, you might be able to help us pull back the veil in some respects. Does Israel go it alone, or does it sort of flag to its allies, including, say, the United States, hey, we're about to do this, we're about to launch an attack, just giving you guys a heads up? Is that something that ever happens?
No, it certainly does happen. Whether it always happens is another question. But generally, when countries are going to undertake these kind of missions, particularly when they're doing it themselves, they do give allies a heads up beforehand. Now, whether they've done that and who they've done that with this time, I guess we'll find out in the fullness of time. But they may well have telegraphed this to the Americans and perhaps some Europeans beforehand.
I know that we have regularly discussed with you the ongoing conflict in Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has had a bit to say about the level of support that has been offered to Israel by its allies, particularly with regards to that weekend defensive operation, compared to what's actually being offered to his forces to repel Russia at this stage. Are his concerns well-founded?
Well, I think so. I mean, Israel and Ukraine are both democracies that are worth defending. There was a massive effort by the US and its partners to defend Israel over the weekend against those 300 plus missiles and drones. These are the kind of attacks that happen every single night in Ukraine against civilian targets, including infrastructure and apartment buildings. And Ukraine is rightly asking, why aren't we receiving a similar level of assistance to protect our people? These aren't military targets, but protect our people against this Russian aggression.
Is there a threat, though, that if the United States, the United Kingdom, I'm just using those examples given what they did in Israel over the weekend, is there a risk, though, that if those countries get involved with that sort of mission with Ukraine, that further provokes Russia and again we are on the verge of a broader conflict in Europe?
Well, that's certainly the messaging that Putin and others put out, and there's always a risk of escalation in any kind of war. But at the end of the day, we either support Ukraine or we don't. You don't kind of support a country that's at war for its survival. At some point, we're going to have to decide whether we want to just help Ukraine defend itself or help Ukraine defeat Russia. At the moment, it's the former. It needs to be the latter.
I noted with interest that the Ukrainian president also signed a new law during the week around conscription, expanding who can be conscripted into the Ukrainian armed forces. You spent a bit of time on the ground there over the course of this conflict. Just how dire is the situation in terms of boots on the ground and people who can continue the efforts to repel invading Russian forces?
Yeah, it's very perilous at the moment for the Ukrainian armed forces on the front line. Many of their brigades are sitting around 50% of their people in those brigades. It makes it very difficult. They also have really significant shortfalls in artillery ammunition as well as air defence ammunition. And this is manifesting in a 10-to-1 firepower advantage by the Russians and the large-scale use of these massive glide bombs that the Russians are using against both civilian and military targets in eastern Ukraine.